Great, just let us know when you're recording.
And we're off.
Great. Hey everybody and welcome. This is going to be planning and building Salesforce integrations. In case it wasn't clear from the context, this is going to be Salesforce integrations with Drupal 7 specifically, before anybody gets shocked that we're not doing this with WordPress or some bizarre Ruby thing. First of all, hello, my name is Campbell Vertesi. It's very nice to meet you. You might know me from the Drupal community as Oh the Huge Manatee, or from Twitter as Campbell Vertesi, or I don't know if you know me from anywhere else. Hi, and you probably owe me a beer. I've been a Drupalist for about 10 years now, a little over 10 years. My specialty is working with large nonprofits, which means that I get to do a lot of CRM integrations. I've definitely done a few Salesforce integrations in my time and also a few less savory CRMs. I should tell you that if you have any option, Salesforce is much easier to work with as far as the integrations go than most of the other alternatives out there. So this is a subject I like to have a lot of fun with. I will talk for a full 3 or 4 or 5 hours on this subject if people let me. So that means please do ask me questions during the presentation. Just type them on into chat. Tina will interrupt me and let me know there's something important for me to talk about, and we can discuss what's going on then. All right, I think that's it. So we can start here with what I'm not going to talk about, which is first of all, basics of Salesforce. You should know coming into this, what is Salesforce? What are various Salesforce editions? What do they do for me? How do you set up Salesforce in a very basic sense for your organization? Likewise, I'm not going to be covering the basics of Drupal. You should know what is Drupal and the fundamentals about how Drupal likes to store data. Don't worry, we're not going to get terribly technical here, but I am going to skip over what is a node and similar questions. So with that out of the way, what we will cover is going to be much more interesting. The big question is, how do you connect Drupal with Salesforce? What are the tools that are available both on the Salesforce side and the Drupal side? What are their strengths and limitations? What's easy to do and what's really hard? How do you make a plan? And actually really important to how do you make a plan, how do you document it so that other human beings can understand what the hell your plan was in the first place? How do you estimate? And then I hope we have some time for me to actually show you guys a basic Salesforce integration and for us to do a little blue sky of what's possible. What are some of the more exciting things that you can do with a properly integrated Salesforce and Drupal system? So this slide is just for your notes. You should copy it down quick because I'm going to move on. How to connect. So Salesforce makes a few endpoint technologies available for you. Basically, you have to authenticate, so whatever requests you make are going to be wrapped in OAuth 2, and Salesforce has a custom query library that you can use, so it's called SOQL, and you have a lot of flexibility there. You can actually query it almost like any other relational database like SQL or MySQL. So that's totally fine, right? You should be able to write a custom module, and I think this presentation is ended early. Or you could do this the easy way. There's already a really, really good module out there called the Salesforce. Well, they call it the Salesforce suite of modules. We'll just call it the Salesforce module for short at drupal.org/project/Salesforce. So this module is mostly maintained now by our friends at ThinkShout. It is very well maintained, and it handles all of that difficult part for you. It definitely has its limitations, but it is far and away the best and easiest way to connect Drupal to Salesforce. I have heard of some organizations doing other kinds of integrations. I have definitely heard of at least one organization that did write their own custom OAuth 2 handler and their own custom SOQL handler, and then a series of custom modules for each integration. That sounds like a really special layer of hell, and I would not go there voluntarily. I have also heard of organizations doing things like they'll use Visualforce to set up a custom page in Salesforce and use, oh, I forget, what is it called? Salesforce's custom language, Apex, to create a query that puts out XML. And they'll have an intern log into Salesforce once a week, download this XML, and then bring it into Drupal with feeds module or migrate module. That also sounds like a really stupid idea to me. If you're going to do that amount of manual intervention, then just have the intern do double entry in the first place and go home early. So what we're going to be talking about today is really focused on the Salesforce module. It is far and away the most capable option here. So the Salesforce suite is actually 5 modules, and they all work together. So I mentioned before, all your requests have to be wrapped in OAuth 2. Fine, so there's a module that handles Salesforce's particular implementation of OAuth 2. And actually looking at this, I realize I have the logo for OAuth 1, but don't let that fool you. There's also a module that's called Salesforce SOAP. That's because Salesforce actually has 2 sets of APIs, one that's a REST-based API and one that's a SOAP-based API. Neither one of them is complete in terms of access to the data. So the Salesforce module combines both of them. Those 2 sound very technical, and they are, and you never need to worry about them as a normal Drupal site administrator. Those 2 modules are what allow you to have the next 3. Drupal to Salesforce mapping, which means you take a Drupal object on one side and a Salesforce object on the other and say field 1 goes to field 1, field 2 goes to field C, and so on and so forth. Then there is Salesforce push, which is responsible for getting data from Drupal and pushing it up to Salesforce, and Salesforce pull module, which is just the opposite, getting data from Salesforce, pulling it down to Drupal. So that's a nice technical overview, but for those of us who are more on the strategy side or more on the site administrator side, you got to know what it really actually does for you. So the strength of Salesforce module is in direct one-to-one mappings between Salesforce objects and Drupal entities. Pushes can happen immediately. As soon as something is updated in Drupal, it can respond and send that up to Salesforce. Pulls are run normally on cron, which means they're time delayed, so typically about an hour's delay. The most important part here is one-to-one mappings between Salesforce objects and Drupal entities. That is the #1 gotcha and difficulty point. So one-to-one mapping, works something like this. This is a series of Salesforce contacts. This is those contacts as Drupal users. Salesforce, Drupal, wax on, wax off. As long as it's one object on either side, then you're probably going to be okay. What Salesforce module doesn't do very well is having one-to-many. So here are our Salesforce contacts, and we want to connect some information into Drupal users and some information into Drupal profiles and some information into Drupal shopping carts. It's not good at that. That's actually really tricky for it. This is the form, that's the main place you're going to be working when you're using the Salesforce module. And this gives you an idea of exactly what I mean by one-to-one again. So it's quite a simple form. You say, this is the kind of entity in Drupal, it's a node. This is the kind of bundle in Drupal, it's an event, that's a content type, is event. Salesforce, it's an event in Salesforce. Now, Salesforce objects can have types, and this supports filtering based on what type it is. But you're really stuck with one Drupal entity bundle or content type matches with one Salesforce object. Beyond that, all you get to do is say, here's the title field from Drupal, and it goes to the event name field, in Salesforce, and you can add as many of these mappings as you like. Oops, did not need to open that for more detail. So what does this mean when we're thinking about this strategically? It means you have to think through how your objects in Drupal map to your objects in Salesforce with a mind to catching red flags. And there are red flags throughout this. There's some things that are so easy in this module and some things that all of a sudden you have to deal with custom code. So, for example, we just mentioned that that one-to-many relationships are not really well handled. They're not handled at all in the UI. That's tricky because we do that a lot in Drupal. For example, it's really common on most websites that involve user profiles to separate out the user's login information, their name, email address, password, from their profile information. Human readable name, address, favorite color, profile picture, that sort of thing. A lot of that has to do with the fact that we like to use the Profile To module for some legacy reasons. It doesn't have to be that way, but it's really common that we have these things separated. Another example is donations, which could be handled any one of about 5 ways off the top of my head, and most of them involve separating out the different steps of the donation into separate kinds of entities. Another really common example would be content authors. On a node entity, it actually only stores the ID number of the author. So if you want to be taking data from that, all of a sudden you're dealing with 2 entities rather than 1. For example, if you wanted to put the author name of an event into Salesforce. Another thing that's tricky that I mention here is non-entity objects. Now, there aren't a ton of those left in Drupal 7. One of the great things in D7 is the universality of the entity model, but they still do exist in some surprisingly common places. The example I give out here is the big gotcha to watch out for, which is the web form module. The web form module, which is one of the most popular modules out there for Drupal, it does not store submissions as entities. That means that you have no way to synchronize web form submissions with any object in Salesforce. There are also some timing considerations that you have to bear in mind. So remember that I said Salesforce pull only happens on cron. It only gets information from Salesforce periodically every hour on the hour or so. That might be difficult in some situations where you want to allow an account representative, for example, to modify the Salesforce contact and have that propagate over to the website in time. The Salesforce module is intelligent about how it resolves conflicts. So if in the meantime the user gets on and modifies their profile, it will take the most recent version, but it's still not a great experience for the user to get off the phone with customer service and find that his changes haven't been implemented. Most of the time, I've only seen this in really specific situations. It also means we have to be careful about our module choice. So I've mentioned a couple times we have to lean very hard on Drupal entities. Instead of web form, let's use entity web form or web form entity. There's only one module, I just don't remember what order it goes in. It's a web form module that stores all of the responses as entities. That makes them easy to synchronize. It is worth, if you have anybody with development ability on your team, it is worth to check into how modules are storing their data. You actually can't assume that they store them as entities. It's also worth considering some things that would be extra complexity if you were only thinking about the Drupal side of things. And I call this here mapping difficult data to a custom entity yourself. So on a code level, that would mean creating a special kind of entity that is just there to be something of a repository for data that's coming from non-entity sources like web form submissions or donations or whatever. On a larger scale, for really complete integrations, it's not uncommon to use the Red Hen CRM, which is a Drupal-based CRM, happens to be maintained by the same people that do so much work on the Salesforce module. And they'll integrate the entire Red Hat CRM in a way that it is totally invisible to the user and Drupal administrator. And it is only there to provide intermediate objects so that that synchronization to Salesforce can be easy. And in the end, custom code is almost always required. I still haven't found many use cases where I've managed to avoid one-to-many object mappings, but there are also some key differences in how Drupal and Salesforce store their information. One example you can see on the right here was trying to synchronize countries from Drupal, country codes for a location field. And Drupal likes to store them as two-character, the ISO standard two-letter country codes. Salesforce stores them as long names. So you could see here I have to do country get list and try and find the two-character abbreviation for each long name. Even worse, Salesforce uses a non-standard long name for the United States, the single most common one in that particular database. So I had to say, no, specifically if you see United States of America, this is the two-character code. That kind of data translation problem is really common. One that I can almost guarantee you'll run into is here at the bottom, which is that Salesforce stores checkboxes, Boolean fields, differently from Drupal. So if you're trying to synchronize anything that is a checkbox in Drupal with a checkbox in Salesforce, you have to do a bit of translation. In this case, this is the user status field. Salesforce, I think it stores it as either the field doesn't exist on the contact, or if it does, it has the word true in it, if I remember right. So we had to translate between being totally empty and having anything at all in it. The last thing that's a real gotcha is remembering that field data validation can be different between Drupal and Salesforce. These are systems that are architected for a different purpose. So the number one example that I come across all the time is if you're going to synchronize users in Drupal with contacts in Salesforce, that seems to make a lot of sense, except Drupal users have to have an email address. That is a requirement in our data model, and it will throw ugly SQL errors and Drupal errors if you don't have an email address. On a Salesforce contact, email is not a required field. You're allowed to opt out of submitting your email. So you might find on your first Salesforce that you get a lot of real ugly, scary messages, and it's just because you have users that don't have email addresses. Another actually favorite example is from a sync where they had a field for website. I thought, oh, that's great. Well, we can use a link field in Drupal. That takes a website just fine. And it turns out that on the Salesforce side, some of the records had values like, give us a call and we'll tell you, or being updated, check back later. That gave me a few hard to diagnose issues in Drupal as well. So you have to watch out for that stuff, and I can more or less guarantee you'll have some of it. So how do we plan for a Salesforce integration? Well, we start with the divide and conquer methodology, where we try and separate out the responsibilities of the front-end website, Drupal, from the responsibilities of your back-end, Salesforce. It can be tempting to mix and match and say, for example, well, we have a form, a web-to-lead form from Salesforce, and we just have to show that in Drupal. Or we can have a Drupal node edit form, and we just embed that in a Visual Force page in Salesforce. This is a really bad idea. Kind of like, oh no, that's not the slide that I was expecting. This is divide and conquer. This is the really bad idea slide. Kind of like this poor girl's fingernails. It looks kind of cool, and it's possible to make your Salesforce interface and your Drupal interface look sort of cool together. Maybe you make a Visual Force page that looks like a like a Drupal page, but just like the fingernails, it takes a lot of effort to make it happen, and even more effort if you want it to last more than 24 hours. My lecture notes for this say terrible, terrible, no good, very bad idea, which should give you an idea of how I feel about it. So we're going to use the divide and conquer methodology, which is we're going to try and think like our users and use that as a proxy for the functional divisions between what Drupal needs and what Salesforce needs. We're going to do a few quick user sketches here, kind of like you do in a full definition phase. So first up we have Gus Tomer. He's our customer, right? Gus Tomer. I hope you guys appreciate the enormous amount of effort I put into these names. This is the bulk of the presentation for me, let me tell you. So Gus Tomer wants to register for events. He wants to maintain his user profile. He wants to manage his registrations, his newsletter subscriptions. Basically, he has a bunch of different ways that he wants to be able to interact with the brand. And he wants those all to be exposed through the website in a reasonable sort of way. Next up we have analytics. Anybody here with Irish relatives? Maybe you happen to have some family who are the Olytic family. Well, Anne is a very well-known analytics analyst. She is interested in getting her Salesforce data into her analytics reports. I use Google Analytics here only as an example because you have a lot of flexibility in getting data from Drupal into your analytics there. She wants to be able to track the success of marketing campaigns that are generated in Salesforce in site outcomes in terms of who actually comes to the site. And she's also interested in doing something like A/B testing, trying to show different content on the website based on what we have in the user's Salesforce profile. This is Cal Center. I really started to reach for the names. So Cal Center wants to have a nap, apparently, according to his picture. He wants to be able to see up-to-the-minute information about how the customer, I'm happy the forum one is dropping an LOL in the channel here. He wants to be able to see how the customers are interacting with the website. This means ideally if somebody has been clicking around the website trying to figure out how the heck to get the donations to work and then phones in, Cal should be able to see that that was the behavior. He also wants to be able to update customer profiles quickly when they call. This should right away set off that red flag of the rabbit, well, I guess it's a hare, the rabbit with the stopwatch. At the minute there's time involved, especially trying to get data from the back end, this should make you start to wonder how you're going to make that happen. Finally, we have my favorite name, Sally Sforcidman. Sally Sforcidman. I should have spelled it differently. Anyway, you try and come up with a name like this. It's very difficult. So she wants to, first of all, finish her lunch without being bothered. She wants to build reports on customer interactions from the Salesforce side of things. She wants to make sure that the user profile information she's using in her reports is accurate and complete. And she wants to include user interactions on the website in her reports. So, for example, to be able to say, well, of people who have visited our page on the Assyrian refugee crisis, such and such a percentage have donated this month, and this is their response to our newsletters, and so on and so forth. So this information I like to lay out in a document, something like what you're seeing on the right here. Note that it's ugly. I actually made this a little bit fancier than usual for you guys. If I have to put this in only a technical-facing document, i.e. not a client-facing document, then I'll usually do this on my desk pad and just take a photo and upload it to our wiki. But if it's going to be client-facing, then of course you make it look nicer. This is mostly about the exercise. This is all the kind of stuff that you think, oh, I can skip over this. I know exactly what we need. I think it's important to go through the exercise because this is how you find those red flags. It's how you make sure you have a really complete listing of things that are going to come back and bite you. So first of all, you can see on the left, I've called out kind of obviously, okay, the customer wants to work with Drupal, analytics person wants to work with Drupal, call center and Salesforce admin are interested in working with Salesforce. On the right is the map of what information you're going to then need in each system. So you can see that even though I've got a one-to-one object association here, that's pretty obvious, sometimes the information needed isn't one-to-one. It's a part of why this exercise is important. If I'm only thinking about the user profile information in terms of what is needed on the front end part of the website, I'm going to forget about some of the user profile information that we want to be tracking in Salesforce, and vice versa. So for example, newsletter subscription. On the front-end website, I only need to be able to show the user that they're subscribed for Cam's favorite newsletter, or Cam's birthday wishes. One of those excellent newsletters that are totally fascinating. I don't care when they subscribed. On the Salesforce side, I'm very interested to know the newsletter subscription rate, when they subscribed, probably even other information like where the user came from. So this next phase of this planning document is to make sure that I have these fields more or less available on both sides. So that date field, I need to remember that that's got to be synchronized from the Drupal newsletter subscription date. It means I have to store it somewhere in Drupal. Usually I'll do that with a different color. This gets you 90% of the way to thinking about leaving breadcrumbs for all of your user interactions, especially on the front-end website, because it's more or less what we're doing. We have to be thinking about what information people want to see in Salesforce and making sure there are breadcrumbs there for people to get, and actually vice versa, what information we want to have accessible in Drupal or analytics package that's based on Drupal, and making sure there are breadcrumbs for that in Salesforce. Again, these are all steps that it seems like you can just do really quickly in your head, and I encourage you to avoid that shortcut mentality. Every time I do this and I take the time to write it out, I find a few gotchas in advance that would have caught me later on. And finding out about the gotchas in advance means that your estimate can be accurate. So what this comes down to is building a list that specifically ends up calling out what are the different objects that will be synchronized. So when do we have one-to-many? Also, what are the different types of fields? Types of fields is important because that's where you're going to encounter those field validation issues that I mentioned earlier, or those field data storage issues. And once you've dealt with that country name issue once, it doesn't matter if you have 5 or 5,000 country fields to synchronize. The difficult part is done. That's going to be really important to your ability to estimate. So estimation for content synchronization with anything, not just Salesforce, it's a lot like estimating a content import or a migration, in that it's easy for it to seem like magic or like it should be more of an art than a science. Basically, we're going to go down that list of fields and figure out, well, where does the mapping look simple and where does it look like it's a little bit problematic? The last time I did a synchronization like this, that field list caught a really good one for me, that in Salesforce they were storing event date and event time in separate fields. And I don't know why, but they were. In Drupal, of course, date time is one field. Just looking at that in a list, I was able to say, okay, that's going to be a problem and that needs specific estimation. Generally, I encourage you to stick to the principle of estimate small things and add them together. Small estimations tend to be accurate, and I think the Scrum people are completely right that if you find yourself trying to ballpark an entire migration, something enormous like that, you're just going to be wildly off. So look down your list for problematic mappings, one-to-many mappings. Count the total number of fields you have. That can be give you a reasonable idea. And if you want to have a rule of thumb, which I encourage you not to use, I myself use about a quarter day for each unique type of field and 2 days for each one-to-many mapping. That's really rough. And of course, the last point here is the most important. Always overestimate. It's really easy to go to a client and tell them, this took a third of the time that I estimated. It's very hard to tell them it's going to take 3 times the time that I estimated. So, Tina, could you give me a time call? If we have time, I'd love to show you building a simple integration.
Yeah, we've got, I'd say about 20 minutes left, so go ahead.
Great, let's do it. So I've got a local Drupal site set up here. Good, I still have access to it. This is basically completely vanilla. The only thing I've done here is I have set up local tunnel to access it over HTTPS. Or I better make sure that that's what I'm doing. That's because OAuth 2, oh yeah, that's working. It just looks ugly. In another window, I'm just going to sneak in and clear cache here. Because if there's one thing that's going to be more frustrating than dealing with a complicated user interface in the Drupal backend, it's going to be doing it without any styles. Well, that's not very good. Oh, you guys are going to get to actually see a little bit behind the curtain here. So my local tunnel expired. So I have to update on the Salesforce side. This is actually, it's a bit of a pain in the butt to develop for the Salesforce, for any OAuth 2 based system on a local development environment. And that's because OAuth 2 requires that that the site, your Drupal site in this case, has to be accessible to the outside world over HTTPS. And most local development environments are not. So here I'm just going into the Salesforce app that I set up for this. There are instructions for how to create this included with the module. Oh boy. I don't remember it taking very long, but that allowed 2 to 10 minutes might bite us in the butt, and we might have to do some blue skying first and then circle back to this. But on the plus side, now we have a theme. Woo! All right, so we have Salesforce is already authorized. This website is allowed to connect to my Salesforce application. I'm going to avoid pressing the authorize button or doing anything that requires authorization for a couple of moments here to give Salesforce a chance to catch up. But most of the action happens here inside structure Salesforce mappings. So you set up a series of mappings and you actually end up being able to drag them into the order that they need to synchronize. Because these are all one-to-one mappings, it's really relatively easy to deal with dependencies. For example, maybe I'm synchronizing users and events, but events somewhere has an entity reference field to users. I need to make sure that users are synced first in that case. We're not going to do anything that complicated though. We're going to create a Salesforce mapping for users. And you can do this with absolutely any entity and entity type. So there's the entity bundle. It's equivalent of a content type in this case. Now we say which Salesforce object we want. I want contact. Now we're going to see if it's allowed to connect to Salesforce. Oh yeah, okay, good. That, 2 to 10 minutes, my butt. All right, now we get to set up our field map. So this is just picking individual fields in Drupal and matching them to individual fields in Salesforce. Let's use full name in Salesforce. You can see that for each field we get to choose what's the direction of synchronization. A lot of the time certain fields will be one way only, either from Drupal to Salesforce or from Salesforce to Drupal. In this case we'll just synchronize them. The other field here is key. This is for marking which field is the so-called unique key on your sync. A unique key is the way that Drupal's Salesforce module can tell that it's looking at the right record. It needs to be unique to that record in both Salesforce and Drupal. So this is what I mentioned before. The first instinct is always to go, oh, we'll just use email as a unique key, right? Each user account only has email once. I also ran into a problem with this on Salesforce because apart from not making sure that email address exists, Salesforce also doesn't make sure that it's unique. You can have 30 contacts with the same email address, and Drupal does not like that one bit. So we have to pick some kind of a property that is going to be unique. A common solution will be to just have the Drupal user ID and create a custom field on the Salesforce side to store that. Since it is relevant, I am going to create a custom field right now. We'll go over here in Salesforce, contacts, wherever you are, fields. I mentioned, well, in order to have something as a unique key, Salesforce actually needs to know that this given field is a unique key for some external system. So we're going to create a new custom field. And in fact, let's do this with email address, because it is a useful unique key. All we have to do, since we're setting up the Salesforce instance from scratch, we just have to remember to not use the built-in email. So we'll call this more better email so that we remember this is the right one to use. And we need to say that is always required, do not allow duplicate values, and set this field as the unique record identifier for an external system. So I'm just going to take the defaults for everything else here, which is about who has access to edit this field in Salesforce and where should it be shown. And if we go to contacts, we can create a contact, and we'll see that we now have, oops, not create a new view, create new, there, new contact. So we have Mr. Testing Tester, and there's the more better email which is required. Ideally spelled correctly. I'm not going to worry about any of the other fields because this is just going to be a quick demo. So now we have our contact over here. Now one thing to note is that if you're creating your record, if you're creating your fields on the fly like this, Drupal's side keeps a cache of what fields are even available. So it doesn't know about my more better email field yet. So I'm just going to save this sort of intermediate thing. It's only half finished. And we will clear caches. So sorry, chicks, I'm going to clear all caches because the time difference just doesn't matter on a new site. That's interesting, but not something to worry about. It's only a notice. So we'll add another field mapping now. Email. And there's our more better email field down here at the bottom. We're going to sync that. We're going to mark it as the key. Now here at the bottom we get to say what are the triggers for when a synchronization should happen. I'm going to say whenever anything happens in Drupal, it should synchronize, and it will by default try and synchronize right away. And also whenever anything happens in Salesforce. Now remember, that's always run on cron, so it won't be immediate. Let's hit save mapping. Now let's have a look at our people. Just make sure. So all I've got here is administrator, but we're going to run cron, which somewhat annoyingly always takes us to another page. Go back to people. Here we have our testing tester. Now, bonus points to anybody who can guess. Okay, I see that we've got 2 questions now, so I'm going to stop in a second. The bonus points to anybody who can guess where our first problem is. It's the status field. That we didn't have anything to sync that from, so status is marked as inactive. That's something we'll need custom code to change. All right, now I'm going to jump over to questions here. Have you had experience syncing taxonomy terms and pick lists? So applying a region through a pick list in Salesforce Developer FDC, I think, that applies a taxonomy term in Drupal. Oh, I see. So having a pick list in Salesforce that creates a taxonomy term in Drupal. That's not something I've ever had to do. That will be a problem for you though, because pick list options in Salesforce don't count as objects, so they don't fit in the data model. That's something that you'll have to synchronize manually. Again, options are not something that are generally expected to be added very often. You could write something in custom code, because I think the options should be visible to you. The options should be visible to you over SOQL. But in fact, probably what I would do was have the Drupal taxonomy set to create new terms as needed. Create new terms when one isn't found, or have in my custom module say if this term doesn't exist yet, create it in Drupal. Second question, have you had experience working with a metadata API to sync things like pick list values? That's absolutely related. I haven't used the metadata API, but my understanding is that it's not supported yet in the Drupal Salesforce module. Again, because you have an OAuth 2 wrapper present and you have an SOQL wrapper already there, in fact, Salesforce queries are based on the same query interface you use for Drupal queries in the code level. You have a really familiar interface for writing custom code, and that's what you would need to do here. Actually, on a bit of a tangent, the metadata API is one of the 2 things that I think are really next areas of development for this module in Drupal that seem like they should be relatively low-hanging fruit. The other one is Salesforce actually has a system for pinging a remote resource with an HTTP call to tell it that there's new data, that something has changed. That's not supported by Salesforce right now, and it would eliminate that problem of having to wait for the next cron run. Doesn't exist yet, though. Those are good questions. Technical, though. So the other thing that I want to show while we have time is what custom code actually looks like in Salesforce. So this is a real-world example from one of the clients that I did this for about 1.5 years ago. And reply from Austin. We also have a checkbox in Salesforce that syncs to the enabled flag in Drupal. Yes, so we can enable and develop and disable Drupal accounts through SFDC. That's exactly what I've ended up doing in every case. If I'm syncing something to an account in Drupal to a user, I end up setting up a checkbox in Salesforce that says, is this user active? The alternative is to assume that all users are active and just have in a custom module add that field that always has a value of 1. That's not a terrible approach if you're sure that they will all be active, but I found in every single case the client has wanted the ability to disable that, to say here's a contact that does not need a user account. So you just default that checkbox to true, and it's more or less the same thing. Good questions, Austin. So this is what a Salesforce hook looks like in Drupal. And if you're not a technical type, you can grab yourself a coffee for about 3 minutes. This won't take long. For the technical types, what you should immediately see here is that this is just a pretty typical hook, and the complexity of code in play is very low. This thing of translating country names to 2-letter values is not complicated. Here's the Salesforce field. This is exactly what Austin was mentioning. I found that I still needed some translation here because Salesforce stores Boolean values, or at least did when I wrote this, stored them differently from how Drupal did. Drupal stores them as 0s and 1s, or likes to accept that into entity metadata wrapper. And Salesforce would just have an empty value, or if I remember right, the actual word true or yes or something like that. Here is the example that I mentioned before. If it's a URL, let's make sure that it's actually a valid URL. This is basically copied from what the link module does. And here's that combining 2 fields from Salesforce to make 1 date field in Drupal. Again, the code isn't terrible. The terrible part is finding these things. And you can find a lot of them in advance. Here's another really commonly used hook, which is hook Salesforce query alter. Lets you jump in right before a query is sent to Salesforce. So you can see here that this interface looks a lot like queries that you might be used to working with in Drupal. So in this case, I made sure that when we're querying for contacts, email should always have a value, and that this checkbox, is UWO user, is always true. What I also do here is add a bunch of fields. This is a part of trying to deal with one-to-many. In Drupal on this site, we're using the Profile 2 module, so that means that there are 2 entities in Drupal for every 1 contact in Salesforce. So I jump into the query and I add some extra fields here. Terrible to do this hard-coded, but sometimes that's the way it is. This is also for that multiple date fields. I see the follow-up from you, Austin, and I'm just going to wait until we're not in the middle of a running thought here. The other half of that 2-entity solution is to have a hook Salesforce pull pre-save alter. So this is right before an object is saved on Salesforce pull. We get to take an extra action. So in this case, right before it saves the user object, we pull out these extra values from those extra fields we added, look to see is there an existing Profile 2 object for it. If yes, we update it. If no, we create it. And this is just using entity metadata wrapper. There's nothing really terrible about this. It's mostly unfortunate that you have to deal with it. So, wrong screen. So Austin's follow-up comment, formula fields in SFDC are another alternative to combining data through code. We use formulas to prep data, then integrate with Drupal. That is actually a really good point. If you are not comfortable using code in Drupal, writing custom modules in Drupal to prepare code, to make those changes like the status field value, or combining multiple date fields or whatnot, you can also do it with custom fields in Salesforce. Custom fields in Salesforce will let you actually write a formula. It's too much of a pain to get there from here for now. Lets you write a formula for what this field value should be. So for example, you'd have that second email field, that more better email field, is actually populated by a formula that just takes the actual value from the normal email field. There's nothing wrong with doing that. I tend to prefer the Drupal system because it makes all of those customizations visible. It makes it easy for me to keep track of where they are. The formulas in Salesforce smells and feels too much like code in the database for my Drupalist instincts, and that's hard to maintain, hard to debug. and hard to keep notes going. So my preference is to do it in Drupal. So just before we get to the questions, I wanted to throw out some blue sky ideas that are things that I've gotten to do or have gotten to talk to clients about or I'm speccing now that I think are pretty cool. So these are both really powerful systems, right? And if you actually manage to unify data between them, you can do things like that analytics dream of A/B testing in Drupal based on their Salesforce profile. I'm in the middle of speccing this out for a client right now to change what is displayed on the front page for their users, depending on what events they've logged in, they've registered for, and also what subject areas, what reports they've viewed, what nodes they've viewed on the site. So if a person has viewed a bunch of blog posts and reports and special features about the Syrian refugee crisis, their front page content is going to be quietly and invisibly tilted more towards that crisis, and it will change their donate calls to action too. Another thing that I'm really excited about is keeping track of engagement in Drupal in Salesforce, so that your Salesforce can include information like, has the user been commenting on posts? Are newsletter subscribers more likely to comment on posts or less likely, and so on. Also, the way you can connect Facebook with both Drupal and Salesforce offers a ton of information that you can react with. Having users log into the site through Facebook is a really great way to get access to their basic demographic information, which is otherwise a bit of a tricky UX thing to get to. And finally, I am really excited about personalized messages in Drupal based on users' other interactions with campaigns. You have to be careful about the wording for this sort of thing because it can get creepy. But for example, a user that's logged in with Facebook and has clicked one of our share buttons or has shared content from the website, that's something that we can see and have access to in Salesforce, and also have access to in Drupal to put up a message to say, hey, we see you shared our post. Thanks a lot. That really helps. Did you get that message? If you get if you have a mail out that's happened from Salesforce and you can see that the user has opened it, you can actually have specific messaging that's encouraging them to check out whatever the call to action was in the newsletter. The sky is really the limit here, which is why I like the term blue sky. When you start combining the kind of information you have about your site visitors in Salesforce and in Drupal, you can make really powerful, customized solutions for those customers, those end users on the website, and make powerful impressions on them. So that's what I've got for you guys. I'd love to hear any questions. I have only one answer, 42. This is actually my first time in a long time doing a webinar, and it's totally bizarre for me that I can't see hands up in the audience or apparently even hear you guys talking.
Well, if there are any questions, if everyone wants to use the question box, and also if you wanted to, Campbell, you're welcome to turn your video on. I'm just going to copy and paste another question that came through from Noah, and so I've put that in the chat box there.
Am I going to be using the Salesforce predictive technology announced at Dreamforce? We're looking at integrating into the predictive API to grab recommended content from SFDC and display in Drupal, but also display the same content in email blasts as well. This is a fantastic question. Oh, that's great. All right, and my video is on now, so I'm allowed to turn off my screen, right? I'll move this over so I can be talking to you. So I haven't had an occasion to use it yet. I am a huge fan of machine learning and of predictive approaches, machine learning driven predictive approaches to user navigation. Most of our projects also involve integrations with Apache Solr, which if you use it right, can provide also really good recommended content links. And it becomes just a question of which predictive technology do you trust more. Because beyond that, I've also been talking to some people about using the new AWS machine learning service to help predict what kind of content people are going to be interested in. I think the Salesforce technology will be powerful. Salesforce has an enormous budget to put towards this. But for me, it remains to be seen what ends up actually producing the best results as far as what users are genuinely interested in seeing. In fact, even machine predictive results sometimes are not as good as a really well-designed community recommendation system. Are there other questions coming, Tina? I can tap dance.
I just got a big thank you from Noah.
Oh, great.
Cool.
Noah, shoot me an email. I would love to talk to you about this some more. Sounds like you really have a lot of good thoughts about this, and this is, like I said, it's a fun area for me.
Cool. He says he will. There aren't any other questions. If people do have questions, there's a little question slide in the webinar panel there. You're welcome to type in there and get another angle of Campbell.
There's my contact information also, if it's useful. Yeah, please do feel free to send me I should have put my Forum 1 email in here. I didn't think about it. You will get a better response if you write to me at campbell@forum1.com. My personal email is, you're welcome to write to me there, but as my wife frequently complains, I never check the thing.
Okay, we've got one more question that's just come in from Keenan.
Ah, great. Similar to the previous, would it be possible to use the information from both Drupal and Salesforce to profile anonymous users? That is a great question. Yes and no. It's difficult to get much information from Salesforce without knowing what contact and contact profile it's associated with. And for an anonymous user coming to the website, we don't really get much. You can use their GeoIP, use a GeoIP library to figure out where they are. You can maybe use one of the libraries that analyzes patterns in their browser configuration to get some idea of at least who they are uniquely, leave a cookie, and keep a trail of where they've been. I'd say the biggest problems with that are, first of all, it's likely to be relatively inaccurate without really careful work and quite a bit of custom work. And secondly, shoot, I just forgot what my second point was, and it was even stronger than the first one. What anonymous information we get? Yeah, mostly it's because we don't actually get a ton. Oh, secondly, it becomes expensive, not just in development time, but also in terms of server load. One of the difficult points with Drupal 7 is performance under load of an enormous amount of traffic. And if you have enough traffic on your site that you're interested in doing profiling and customization for anonymous users, it can become a real problem for you to be generating every page. It's not impossible, certainly, but it imposes an order of magnitude more complexity. Like right off the bat, I'd say if you're going to do that, then let's use edge side includes, let's use auth cache module. Let's try and minimize how many components of the website are going to be customized for those anonymous users, because you don't want 100% of your traffic coming to your site to be logged in users if you can at all avoid it. Next question from Noah. SFDC Marketing Cloud cookies users and brings in anonymous history, and once the person identifies his or herself. Yeah, Pardot does that too. Yeah, and he mentions this assumes the person is using the same computer, and so it has slightly mixed slightly mixed results. That's right, and you need to embed. It's honestly also a little bit questionable tactics in terms of good for the internet, and you would need to include a chunk from Salesforce loading on the page as well. And yeah, it's the issue that I've had with Pardot is the accuracy. It assumes the person is using the same computer. It assumes that they're not, that there's no cookie blocking going on. It assumes that it's not a shared computer, and it's very easy for that identity to get thrown off by things like dynamic IPs. So it is possible, but it takes a lot of work, and I would be careful with customizing too much because I don't believe that you can consider that identifier reliable enough.
Okay, and he says a little bit earlier, he said he agreed with you. So
That's good.
I
Man, I'm
think
always worried that I'm wrong.
and Keaton thanks you as well. He says these are great points. So I know that we're 2 minutes over, so we are officially going to wrap this up. But you do have Campbell's information here on the screen. Huge thanks, Campbell. This was great. This was a lot of information to get through in 1 hour. But we look forward to having this conversation continue. We will have more webinars coming up. This is going to have recording, so you're welcome to get that. We'll be sending that to you. And hopefully you can get a chance to see Campbell again soon.
Yeah, I really hope so. I'm at every DrupalCon except Barcelona, apparently. So I'm happy to meet you guys in person or shoot me an email. I love to talk about this stuff.
Great.